My name is Nicci Gerrard and the book I've written is called What Dementia Teaches Us About Love. It's a meditation really on what dementia means, not just what it means for people who live with it, for people who care for them, for the doctors and the nurses who look after them, but what it means for us as a society, psychologically, socially, emotionally, even existentially. What dementia teaches us about love is not just for those people who have or have had intimate experience of an illness which can be very ravaging and devastating, but it's for, I guess I'd say it's for everybody, because it really tries to ask what we learn from it, what we learn about what it is to be human, about what we owe each other, about how we treat people who can no longer look after themselves, who are vulnerable and are at our mercy. I think until really quite recently, the subject of dementia was like a black hole, and people who were living with it felt that they were lost to us, that they became missing people. And when we thought of them, often it was almost as if they were no longer human, as if they'd become an object. But I think in the last decades, we've become much more mindful about what dementia means, not just what it means for those people who have it, but what it means for all of us who care for them in whatever way, and who might one day be in their position. And increasingly, I think there's been a way in which we feel we can in some way accompany them on that journey. Now, the journey can be terrifying, sometimes not so terrifying, but it can be full of kind of sorrow and of terror. But we can accompany them, and we can still think of them as human and as precious. It forces us to think about what we value in our lives. Now, in modern times, perhaps I'm saying, we've put so much value on being an individual, being self-sufficient, having agency, having autonomy, being successful, being young, being beautiful, being happy. And of course those things are important. But when you think about what it's like to have dementia, when you think about what it's like to lose the sense of self, to lose the memories, to lose the things that bind us to each other, then it makes us think about how we value other things. What do we think about people once they no longer know who they are or who we are? How do we deal with that level of kind of confusion and vulnerability? The way one tries to describe and talk about dementia is fraught with problems. I mean, I'm writing a book kind of for and to and about people who, as they go further into their illness, they lose that ability to express themselves, to speak for themselves. But it's that thing of trying to imagine what it's like to lose yourself, to have no sense of yourself, to lose your word, no longer to be able to say, kind of, I am. And that thing about losing a voice is about losing an ability to connect the inner self with the outer world. So when I was writing the book, I was continually bumping up against this thing about how to express what's inexpressible. It's like a kind of decreation of meaning. How can you make meaning out of something that's all about loss of meaning? And actually, there are different things to be said about that. One is that you just have to strain for words, and often that's all about kind of metaphor and simile and kind of standing at the kind of dark mouth of the cave trying to strain to see in. But also there are other ways of having a voice that's not just about words. I mean, a lot of the time when I was researching the book, I'd be with people who couldn't speak, but they could touch. They could meet your eyes, they could sometimes dance, they could listen to music. And it was extremely kind of poignant and sometimes rather joyful to be with people and to suddenly realise that there are lots of ways of speaking to each other. And there have been occasions during the time that I've been working on this book when I felt completely blown away by how they were teaching me things. I mean, they were teaching me how to dance, they were teaching me how to look at art, they were teaching me about how to listen to music, but also they were just teaching me about how to be more available to what meaning is. There are many ways of speaking without words, and one of the joys of writing this book is discovering or rediscovering some of those ways. One of the kind of central themes in this book is the absolute importance of connections. One reason that people can disappear quite quickly when they have dementia is they are no longer able to make connections with the world. And one of the things that the book kind of wants to be about is the importance of just keeping those alive in whatever way. You know, when my father was dying, that thing of just touching him, of putting a hand on his body, of kind of trying to meet his eyes, of just recognising that there's a human there. I think that even though dementia is all around us, I wasn't properly aware of it until it came into my life in a kind of very kind of big and distressing way when my father had dementia. More than the first 10 years when he was living quite contentedly with dementia. In the last 9 months of his life, he was not really living at all. He was having a kind of drastically slowed down form of dying. And if it hadn't been for witnessing that, and then of launching a campaign to do with how we should deal more compassionately with people who are living with dementia, I wouldn't have written this book. It was, I think, my kind of seeing and experiencing the sorrow of his dying made me think about how we could think about it better. One of the things about dementia is dementia, it is a diagnosis, but it isn't just a diagnosis. People can be told they have dementia a decade or more than a decade before they die, and it's not just a horror story. There are lots of ways of living well with dementia, really quite, you know, until the end, actually. One of the things that I've always thought, and I used to always say, was that we are made of our memories, that's who we are. We're made up of all the accumulated memories, the things that we've paid attention to over our life. So the big question, of course, is when you have dementia and you have no memories left, does that mean you're unmade, that you're not a kind of real person anymore, that you don't have an identity? And until I kind of witnessed at close hand kind of my father dying, and now have met lots of other people in his position, I would have always thought that. And now I just don't think that anymore. I think there's something else that we're made of, that something remains when memories go, some kind of indelible kind of marker on the self. I mean, the book is full of stories, and it's full of stories not just of kind of the doctors and the nurses and the philosophers and the artists. It's full of stories of people who are living with dementia, but with kind of courage and a kind of joyfulness and stoicism, and also their carers, who I can't tell you how highly I think of carers. I mean, we should be on our knees thanking them for what they're doing. And it's extraordinary. And lots of them aren't even doing it knowing that they're doing a wonderful thing. They're just doing it because that's what you do when you love somebody. Because it's about kind of memory and forgetting. I mean, I think Ishiguro, for instance, he doesn't directly write about dementia, but all of his books are about kind of memory and dislocation and not standing on firm ground. And so suddenly when you start looking at books, they feel like they're kind of under subject. Is this kind of terror of the loss of self? I mean, I'm very struck by how it's invisible. It's still, it's much less invisible than it used to be, but it's still quite invisible. And often that's because they're shut away. They're literally shut away. They're in their house being looked after. They're in residential homes being looked after. They're in hospitals being looked after. And for a long time we just haven't wanted to look at them. And I think we haven't wanted to look at them. You know, there's a farcical nature to losing your memory. And so we kind of push it away and we give it these, you know, we kind of associate it with a kind of stigma of self-loss. But once you start talking about it, and then other people start talking about it, and people who are living with it start talking about it, and you suddenly think, okay, they're not so different. You don't cross over a line into a different world and become a different person. They're among us, and so they should be with us as well as being among us. The diagnosis isn't just a sentence, it's just the beginning of another chapter, and it might be a scary chapter, but it holds lots of other things as well. You haven't turned into a different person. And the second thing is, the more that we can think of it as something we have in common, you know, that we're in this world together, we are at each other's mercy. There is no we without an I. We have to think about it just in more of a more kind of human, collective, kind, patient way. I mean, I think that if you get a diagnosis of dementia, or someone you love gets a diagnosis of dementia, if I was to offer any advice apart from get lots of medical help, because there are things, it would be just to talk to other people about it. And you think you're alone, and then you suddenly realise you are just not alone.